Hello, everyone. It's Saturday night at 10 o'clock. Welcome to Starfleet Tactical. I, as always, am Chris Weave. Patrick Doyle is, as always, Patrick Doyle. Right, Patrick Doyle?
As far as I know, that's what the voices in my head keep saying.
So do those voices in your head also remind you that we don't speak for our employers, past, present, or future? Do they also say that to you?
There's a whole choir.
Good. Glad that all happened. So we actually, those of you who are watching did not necessarily see this, but we've got Alec actually starting the show tonight, but he's now in the process of rebooting his computer because his network was having issues, and I think that's why we saw some things happen. I think he was having computer problems, but I understand how that goes because I'm having computer problems today too, but hopefully, fingers crossed, I'll get through the show without having to reboot. Luckily, if I do have to reboot, Pat in his bulletproof computer setup will be able to take over and do it without me if need be.
Right. So there may be only one.
There may be only one. So, Pat, how'd your week go?
Standard busy week, but went well. I got signed off to do flight examinations on people and stuff like that. So I am now the, I guess I could now be the dreaded person that you see when you show up to work and you have to be tested. So
did they give you a clipboard?
No, they gave me an iPad, but I could always put a little clip on it if I needed to.
That's true. You could. So that's good.
Yeah. How was your week?
It was there. Nothing real special happened. Other than I can't remember. Did I tell you that I've got a medical procedure scheduled now?
No, I know you. I believe you went for a visit.
Yes.
Recently, but
so I can't remember exactly. As I've told this story to about 15 different people at 15 different times, so I can't remember how much I said here. But I ended up in the ER a couple of weeks ago. Spent the night in the ER for what is for me a relatively routine reason. I've got some minor atrial fibrillation, atrial flutter issues. I had a procedure called a cardiac ablation a couple of years ago, which involves them going in through veins in your leg and running a sensor package up one side and another package up the other side. And that other package uses a device called a laser to burn out the nerves that are misfiring in your heart, and then the scar tissue forms and your heart doesn't go all wonky. And so it's not unusual for people that have to have this procedure done once for them to have it done a second time. And I'm going to have it done on the 1st of November. But to give you an idea of how dramatically serious this open heart surgery type thing is, it's an outpatient procedure. So I'll be home that evening. Last time I did it, it wasn't an outpatient procedure. I had to spend the night, but that was a different hospital in a different state. They had me spend the night. And to be honest, the absolute worst part of the entire procedure was the catheter.
Well, that doesn't sound like a good part of any day.
No, it's not. So hopefully they won't have to do that this time around. I'm expecting to, I'll go home that day. And the big thing is I end up missing a bunch of work because you can stand. Last time I did this, I was basically doing laps around the cardiac unit that night because I was just bored and had a lot of energy and I didn't feel like just laying in bed anymore. You can stand, you can lay down, you can walk. The one thing you can't do is sit because they go in right where your thighs connect to your torso. And so if you sit, it puts all the pressure on the incision and it hurts like hell. So
maybe that standing desk isn't such a bad idea after all.
No, except that would make my ankles hurt. So the upside
so you're kind of screwed.
Well, to be honest, I've got a bunch of work reading that I can do on my my Kindle and on my iPad. So I'm going to read Matt Caffrey's History of Wargaming book. I'm going to read Jeff Applegate's book. He's a Naval Postgraduate School guy who did a book on wargaming that I can't remember the title of right now off the top of my head. And I'm going to read Graham Longley Brown's Successful Professional War Games: A Practitioner's Handbook. And so between that right there, I just described about 2,000 pages of reading, somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 pages of reading. So that's probably about a week's worth. So,
really, you could do that in a week?
It's only 400 pages a day. There's illustrations and stuff.
Yeah, without pictures, I'd be hosed. I'm a pilot, man.
So they have pilots write the little cards that you have to read?
No, pictures. Pictures. You need lots of pictures.
Yeah, with the airplane just gently sitting on the water.
Yeah, like that.
The event of a water landing. Yeah,
Well, it's worked once, at least in recent history.
That's true. That's true. We do occasionally see water landings. So
yeah. So, not an entirely bad thing to take a gander at every time you go fly. Count the number of rows between you and the exit.
To be honest, I always do that shit.
Yeah, you should.
A tiny little bit of situational awareness helps.
Well, if you can, because if you can get there with your eyes closed, you've got a chance.
You know what the trick I was taught on how to egress from a helicopter is? So I
wait till it stops moving.
Well, you need to make sure the blades aren't moving anymore. I've never done the dunker, right? The helo dunker is just sort of famous. One of my colleagues at CNA, she did the helo dunker and the P3 dunker. She got dunked a total of like 7 times in 6 hours. And it was not fun. And I walked into her office when she came back and I said, "Hey, how was the dunker?" And she said, "Oh, it's far worse than you can imagine." She was a swimmer, right?
I didn't think it was that bad. I got kicked in the face with a boot once. But
did you do the dunker?
Yeah, I've done all the dunkers.
Oh,
I've done the whole program. Yeah. Even where
I guess that makes sense.
They take you parasailing. And then where you're wearing the parachute and all the stuff, and then you've got to disconnect and float into the water and then not drown, by having the parachute pull you under and stuff like that.
Well, that's good. I'm glad that worked out, because I'd feel pretty stupid just talking to a blank screen.
That's right.
So I didn't get a chance to do any of the dunkers. I really kind of wanted to. I wanted to do an overseas deployment to Japan and ended up not being able to do that and didn't do any of the dunkers. But what I was told is that when you go on the helicopter, right, you're basically a bench seat on either side of the wall, right? And so for things like a Chinook. And so if you're going to go in the water, grab the metal pole that forms the bench underneath you, because it's one of those metal framework and canvas. Grab that metal pole with whatever hand allows you to have your thumb pointing in the direction of the door.
Mm-hmm.
And do not, under any circumstances, let go.
Yeah. Strangely enough, so I did it twice, and as I recall, it was once where you could see, and then once blindfolded. I actually found it easier to do it blindfolded because you're less distracted by all the flailing boots and feet and legs and arms around you. You could just simply, all right, I know I've got to go this far and do this, and you could you focus. But it wasn't a real life thing. And, that would be, I'm sure, totally terrifying in a whole different way.
On the P3 dunker, I was told there were certain scenarios where they let you have an oxygen bottle.
Mm-hmm.
And my friend at CNA said that she really, really liked the oxygen bottle.
Well, it's a wonderful thing underwater.
Big fan of the oxygen bottle, so much that she was thinking about buying one.
Well,
just so that she'd always have one.
That seems to make a lot of sense. I mean, it is the not breathing thing that often kills people. If it's not the deceleration trauma, it's the not being able to breathe.
Yeah. So I did know somebody at CNA who spent 6 hours in the water one time. He was at Pax. He was the rep down at Pax River back when they were testing the SH-60. And he was out on a test flight. They were out in the Caribbean, and he was on a test flight, and the helicopter went down. They knew they were going down. They had plenty of time to sort of prep for it. So they end up in the water, and they all leave. And then somebody went, "Where's the life raft?" And it's still inside the helo. And once it gets in the once you end up out of the helicopter, you don't go back in. But he said that he spent 6 hours bobbing in the water, and basically a wave would come over and push you under, and if you've got enough flotation, and then you float back to the surface, and if you've got enough flotation, you go up fast enough that you get to breathe before the next wave pushes you under.
So heavy seas, huh?
Yeah, heavy enough, and they were mildly hypothermic. It was warm water, and they were mildly hypothermic by the time they were picked up by the surface ship that came.
Yeah, I remember seeing a man overboard chart a long time ago, and it's time in the water versus the temperature, and then somewhere in there there's this one band of temperatures and time where you become hypothermic. Yeah, and then there's this other band where it's slightly warmer, less chance of being hypothermic, but you're eaten by sharks. So it's kind of it's based on the water temperature. It's how much time do we have to get them before he either freezes to death or gets eaten. There's this one narrow band that's a survival band that you got a little more time, but it's been a long time though.
This strikes me as the sort of thing that Starfleet officers probably don't train for.
It's entirely possible.
But that actually leads to a very interesting little sidebar that we could do at some point. We should think about this. This is probably not something to go down tonight. But what are sort of the equivalents of that, right? You wouldn't have like a regular man overboard drill, right? You can't just fall out of the spacecraft, but you do have men working in suits outside the ship.
Yep.
You do have like radiation hazards and stuff. That's one of the things I fell in love with the Battlestar Galactica miniseries when I heard them come over the 1MC. That's the shipwide intercom for those who've never been to sea. They came over the 1MC and they said there are men working in suits outside the spacecraft. Do not radiate. Blah 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 blah. There are men working in suits.
Yeah.
So the thing that was really cool about that is, first of all, that's a real threat, right? If you're on board a Navy ship, if they're doing any work on the radars, et cetera, there are men working aloft. Do not radiate, blah, 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 blah. There's all sorts of gear that you turn out. You tag it out. You put a tag on it that says, do not use this because you're going to kill people, guys. And they make that announcement. And when they make announcements like that, they always make them in exactly the same way.
Mm-hmm.
They do not just make it up on the fly. There is they call it the litany. There is an accepted litany for how you do it. And the Navy uses litanies for everything from how they go about launching a weapon to sweepers man your brooms.
That's right.
It always sounds exactly the same. And there's always there's some other fiction. Scott Geyer's Ganellan series. One of the things I've noticed about that is he always, whenever they're doing stuff, they always do them in the same order.
Mm-hmm.
And it reads like they're going through a checklist. He doesn't actually have them go through a checklist, but it looks like a checklist. It feels like a checklist. And that actually caused me to send him an email and say, hey, I've got this theory that you're like a naval aviator, that you're like a P3 guy or something. And he said that he had been assigned to a squadron during his Navy career. So technically he was a naval aviator, but he didn't actually have wings because he got out before. He was right after Vietnam, and they were doing the Vietnam drawdown. And so basically he got his 4 years at the academy and only had to be in the Navy for like 3 years afterwards.
Okay.
So they paid for him to leave. So
yeah, well, I mean, after I got commissioned, they were offering people, hey, you did this 4-year ROTC thing. If you don't feel like sticking around, you don't need to. I'm like, yeah. Sorry, I didn't wake up at 5 a.m. multiple days per week, just to call everything good. So,
I once dropped a class because it was at 8 o'clock in the morning, and I just look back upon that, and I'm just stunned at the idea that I dropped a class because 8 a.m. was too early.
Teenagers need their sleep.
Yeah, I was a 21-ager.
Yeah, well, not that much difference, I think, between a teenager and a 21-year-old.
Not that much difference. Not that much difference. So, let's see. We were going to talk about. So Pat and I had our normal conversation that we do during the middle of the week, where we go like, "Hey, Pat, I just remembered we have this show that we do on Saturday nights, and we need to prep for it." And luckily, Pat had a couple of really good ideas. One of which we're going to do at some other time because Pat was involved in another war game session. So people seem to like the war game analysis that we did the last time. So, and by we, I mean Pat. So people like that. And so we're going to do that again at some point. But tonight we're going to, over to you, Pat.
Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about the Deep Space Nine episode Return to Grace. So let's share.
So while he's bringing that up, this is an episode where Gul Dukat is a freighter captain. He's been reassigned as a freighter captain, and he's given the task of taking Kira Nerys to some sort of diplomatic conference with the Cardassians. This is during the Cardassian-Klingon War. And so he is a lowly freighter captain, but he's going to work his way back up through the power structure and become the guy he is again. And
hey, you know what?
What?
Alex, if you happen to be listening, I think I need you to do whatever voodoo you do to let me share my screen.
He needs to share the screen.
Yeah.
And so, and of course, this being Cardassia, a highly militarized society, there really isn't such a thing as civilians in this world. And so the end result of that is, this is a military freighter. It's supporting the war effort, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's kind of a nifty episode that I honestly had never seen before. So I enjoyed it quite a lot, although there's some quirks here and there in that episode.
All right. Well, I shot him a text, and hopefully he's able to do that. So anyhow, so in this episode, I can kind of go through the synopsis of it anyways right now. But in this episode, Kira Nerys needs to get to a conference in Cardassian space. And it's during the Klingon-Cardassian War, like Chris said. And actually, it starts off with Kira getting vaccinated. And she's going through all of these, the doctor's giving her all these vaccines and stuff like that. It's kind of interesting. And basically they're saying, well, since the war started, their entire health system has collapsed and diseases are rampaging through the Cardassian Empire. So I've only got 12 more vaccines to give you before you can go. And then he goes like, oh, by the way, are you seeing like orange spots and globes floating around or something like that? So she's having all sorts of side effects and everything too. So, anyhow, so as she's sitting around waiting, turns out Gul Dukat comes to her quarters and says, "Yeah, I'm the one taking you." So she hops on board the freighter, and somehow during this war, she's agreed to get on a Cardassian freighter to travel through a war zone to have a conference. So I don't know, as head work goes, this doesn't seem like a great idea to me. But if it was so important, why didn't she go with all the other dignitaries from Bajor? But anyways, I digress. That's not really the point of the discussion. But one of the big things he does is he does his best to run the ship as a military combat vessel. So he runs frequent drills on board the ship. And as they arrive at the location of this, hey Chris, actually I got an idea. Are you able to share? Would you be able to share your screen? No. Okay.
Guess it helps to unmute. So no, I can share it, but I mean I can start it like you can, but I don't have the magic capabilities. We need to work on that a little bit.
Okay.
We'll make it
all
work.
Right. Okay, sounds good.
So carry on.
Very well. I shall carry on. So anyways, once they arrive, they find that the colony's been obliterated, everybody's dead, and then a Klingon bird of prey decloaks. And it looks them over. Now they're at war, so I fail to understand the Klingon Empire's rules of engagement here, at why they don't why they completely essentially ignore a Cardassian freighter. But for whatever reason, they do. It looks them over, and then it turns around to leave, and it even lowers its shields. And it's moving away at a leisurely 1/4 impulse power. Since that's the speed at which, Captain Kirk leaves space dock, it's not a super fast speed. And so they're clearly not in a hurry, and they're not too busy, and they clearly are too busy to even bother to destroy this little freighter. And so I don't have any particular retcon or explanation for why the Klingon ship would just totally ignore a potential freighter that they could damage. And James McCoy points out, yeah, there's no honor in killing a helpless foe. But my only thing there is the Raiders just killed a Cardassian colony on a planet. So that explanation, while it seems okay, isn't really consistent with their behavior. And by the way, Klingon bird of prey is meant to kind of act like a submarine from World War I or World War II. Go out, do raiding, and make little pinprick strikes against the enemy. So anyhow.
Well, and I guess I'd add two things onto that. One, a military target. The freighter would be a military target in this situation. And two, Cardassians don't really have civilians, do they?
Well, I mean, it's a totalitarian government, right? So I guess in the same way that Germany during World War II had civilians, or
I think
or
it's
some
actually,
other totalitarian state.
I think in a lot of ways it's even worse than that. It's even more extreme than that, because they all seem to sort of view themselves as, basically employed by the state. Cardassia seems to be the closest that we've seen, I think, actually to like sort of I don't want to say calling it a communist society is wrong, in that it has implications that aren't true, but
well, right. But I do think it's totalitarian. I think is at least a statement that is probably minimally descriptive but accurate. Don't know exactly how their government works, but it seems very 1984.
Yeah, somebody commented that a freighter is not a worthy opponent of a Klingon military vessel. Klingon Academy, the game went into that. That makes sense. I mean, the Klingon. With the Klingons, it's like UBU.
Yeah. So anyways, but like I said, so for all these reasons, but again, the Klingons are an alien species. Why they choose to do the things they do doesn't have to make sense to us. So, and all it has to do is make sense to them. So apparently, for whatever reasons, they don't attack the freighter. But Gul Dukat, furious, arms the phasers on his little ship, and Kira says, "What the hell are you doing? We're no match for them." And he says, "Hey, I'm not going to let this stand. It's not going to go unchallenged." And so he goes ahead and then so Kira says, well, if you're going to shoot at it, shoot at its underside where the armor is the weakest. So, they do that. They take the shot. And then one thing I'd like to say, in one of the battle drills, so we do see in the beginning of the show, they're running battle drills and on this freighter. So clearly he's trying to keep his crew sharp and trained. So they may not have been able to pull off any of this other stuff had he not been such a, devoted to doing battle drills. That may have helped them pull off what they do later on in this episode. But furthermore, as they're arming the weapons and stuff during this battle drill, it takes a really long time to arm their weapons and stuff. So, I mean, they're clearly on a freighter. Even if this is a good battle-hardened crew, they're still limited by the equipment that they're flying. So he takes the shot, and it doesn't even penetrate the unshielded soft underbelly of the Klingon bird of prey. So, and Klingon bird of preys are armored to some degree, but a Burrell is a relatively small ship. Hey, look at that! All right, thank you. Here we go. Okay, so these are some of the early shots of Dr. Bashir giving her the vaccines and all that kind of stuff. And so in the oversimplified synopsis, Kira's being transported to the conference. They engage in combat with his freighter against a Burrell-class Klingon bird of prey. And they eventually capture the Klingon ship, and then Dukat essentially plots his return to power. So this show really leads into four topics, basically: training and improvisation. So I've talked about how he's running these battle drills on board the ship. So his crew, for a freighter crew, could be about as good as you can expect them to be for the fact that they're on a freighter. We'll get in a little bit into the great Klingon bird of prey debate, and I'll tell you what that is. And then this also leads into Q ships. So for those of you that don't know what Q ships are, we'll talk about that. And then, of course, transporter tactics, right? Boarding actions. Why don't they just, if you really start thinking about the military implications of being able to use matter transportation of people and equipment to places, you start thinking you can start getting real imaginative, like why bother with weapons? Just beam the enemy crew into space and stuff like that. So we'll talk about some of those things too. So like I said, he's trying to run it like a military vessel. But it's not a warship. So no matter how good their training happens to be, they're limited by their equipment. But they're probably better prepared for a fight than certainly any other freighter, and maybe even a few warships. But this freighter has very weak shields. The phasers take a long time to arm, and the phasers are clearly very weak. They can't even damage a Klingon bird of prey. So, it's probably better for shooting, little pieces of space dust and debris and stuff like that might get in their way. But that's about it. So when they arrive at the Korma colony, the colony's been destroyed, no survivors, and there is a Klingon bird of prey there. So now that leads into the great Klingon bird of prey debate. Okay, so as far as we know, there are roughly 3 size classes of the bird of prey design. So there's the little bird of prey, which is probably what we saw in Star Trek 3 and Star Trek Generations, the D11 or the D12 class birds of prey. At least that's what we believe those classes are referred to. We don't have a particular name for them that I've ever heard. The medium-sized bird of prey is the Burrell, and we see that in Next Generation. It has a crew of 36, and this is the style of bird of prey that Dukat encounters. And then there's the big bird of prey, which is the Cavort. That's the one we saw in yesterday's Enterprise, and I think we've seen them in Sins of the Father and stuff in some of the episodes involving the Klingons' Civil War. Or Redemption, perhaps, was one of the other continuation of that storyline. So various people put all of these ships in different size ranges, so it's really hard to pin everything down. But we know that the D11, D12, the smaller ship, it has a crew of about 12 on board, and it's a relatively small ship. The sizes that I see seem to range between 100 and 110 to maybe 80 meters long. So it's a relatively small ship. The Borel, it seems to be, let's see, I don't know if this picture, Chris, is this picture showing up? And you're muted, Chris, if you're trying to talk.
Yeah, I was trying to talk. Pull it back a little bit.
Okay.
And now up a little bit. A little bit more. Yeah, that's pretty good.
Okay.
So,
go ahead.
Is there 3 ships on that picture or just 2?
There's only 2 because
Okay.
this is more of a next generation era type book.
Yeah, so one of the things that I just realized kind of drives me nuts is that if you've got 3 ships that look like exactly the same, except they're different in size and hence they're different in capabilities, I would think that your doctrine would say that you don't refer to them as birds of prey, but you actually call them by their class.
Mm-hmm.
So that, because the difference between dealing with a D11 and a cavort,
probably a little different,
or even just a Borel and a cavort, right? It makes a difference. You're going to react differently if it's a cavort than if it's a Borel.
Yeah, agreed.
So I will admit that I'd rather just go for the idea that in the alternate universe they decided to actually have it be the Romulans rather than the Klingons, and we could just avoid this. They both have birds of prey, and that they spend a little bit more time on not just reusing models and pretending they were bigger than they were.
Yeah.
But,
It's, I mean, there is that's like a whole separate episode talking about Star Trek 3 and what they did with the models and what the story background and stuff was going to be. And because originally that was supposed to be a Romulan ship. And then they said, well, maybe it's a Klingon version. So,
and since they had the model around, they had this tendency to just grab it in next gen whenever they needed a Klingon ship.
Right, exactly. So, but as far as the relative sizes go, the Borel appears to be about 140 some meters long, maybe 150 meters. So it's got a crew of 36. And then the Cavort, at least according to Rick Sternbach's book here, is about a 350 meter ship. There are various other sources out there, probably even, I'd be willing to bet, the DS9, where they have like this ridiculous 700 meter size rating for the ship. And that one's a little hard to stomach. Let's see, what do we got? Nope, even the DS9 one has the DS9 book has the length at 780 meters. So that's 140 meters larger than the Enterprise D. So that's a really ridiculous size for the ship. So anyhow, so there, like I said, and the DS9 is widely acknowledged as wrong in a lot of cases. I could even show you where there's they clearly just cut and pasted the same ship data to different ships in there. So so there's a lot of errors in that. So I don't trust it. I go with Rick Sternbach's book. But anyways, so that's our.
I think technically they're both Rick Sternbach's book.
You may be right. Excuse me. Yep, Herman Zimmerman, Rick Sternbach, Doug Drexler. But I don't know. Maybe they had an editor that.
I think they had some help.
Right. Either way, or they're just making a correction. But that does not make too much sense. So, anyways, so that's our foray into the sort of. This is the way I think about it with the 3 different eras of. Or the 3 different versions of the Klingon bird of prey. And then I will say that there is on-screen evidence. So now I generally don't put a lot of on-screen stock into on-screen evidence because it's highly inconsistent depending on what the writers wanted and what the special effects artists were told to put together and to do. But most sources consistently indicate, and this picture, the big ship here in this picture is a Vorcha, and they're consistently labeled as 481 meters long. So this is why I completely reject that the Vorcha, or the Cavort, excuse me, is 700 meters long. I mean, it'd be much larger than a Vorcha class cruiser. So that just doesn't work. So for those of you out on the internet, I think you could reject that. However, you see these little birds of prey in the foreground, one riding just underneath that Cavort, and that is clearly much smaller. I'm sorry, that bird of prey is clearly much smaller than a Vorcha here. So that could be some version of the D11 or the D12 in Deep Space Nine, and that took part in the attack on Deep Space Nine. And we see a lot of these things blow up after just like getting hit with a few torpedoes and stuff. So I think I counted that there were I estimated there was like 27 of these in the attack. So they could be Borels, or they could be the smaller D12s or something like that. So anyways, so that's my little going into a rabbit hole on that one.
So speaking of rabbit holes, somebody asked the question, do we have a good idea which class of bird of prey was General Chang's fire while cloaked prototype?
I believe it was one of the smaller ones.
Okay.
Even from the, there's no they don't truly say. So it's all speculation. However, it did not look like a particularly large ship when it got sandwiched in between the Enterprise and the Excelsior. And, we kind of saw them all on screen together, a few torpedo hits. They were clearly overkilling it because they were both lobbing, full spreads of torpedoes at it, but they wanted to make sure they killed it dead. So,
and not just mostly dead.
And not just mostly dead. Exactly. I did watch that about 2 weeks ago. It was fantastic. Hadn't seen it for years. Let's see here. So now the next topic that this brings up is Q ships. Okay. And, basically a Q ship was an armed freighter that, they would be sailing around in World War I and World War II. They would keep their weapons hidden. And the idea was to take a submarine or a merchant raider by surprise, because there were a lot of times where the submarine, we always think of the submarines as, they're under the water with the periscope, they fire a submarine. The ship never had any idea that they were being attacked. But that didn't always happen. Sometimes, especially, I think it probably happened more in World War I, the submarines would surface. They usually had a deck gun, and, that might be the indication. And I think and Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a little more of that chivalry there where they were like, hey, we're here. We're going to sink your ship. You've got a little time to get off the ship. And I'm sure that went by the wayside eventually, but.
Yeah. And in World War I, there was a lot more ships that were sunk by the deck gun than you saw in World War II. In World War I, the deck gun was actually an offensive weapon, and they generally let people get into lifeboats, etc. Before World War II, the U.S. doctrine said that you don't just shoot freighters. That's piracy. You need to let the crew have an opportunity to get off, etc. And towards the early days of the war, there was some instances of submarines basically telling crews to vacate their ship before we sink you.
Well, maybe the Klingons read that doctrine.
Yeah, but that very quickly went by the wayside because it turns out that chivalry stuff is a really good way to get yourself killed.
Sure is.
Submarines. So, like with your average surface ship, you actually have to go and do significant amounts of damage to take it out. Submarines, you basically just poke a hole in them and let the ocean kill them. And so submarines really are eggshells armed with hammers, and if you're an eggshell, you eventually stop being chivalrous.
Yeah.
And so you shouldn't confuse any of this stuff with something called the auxiliary cruiser, which takes up a surprisingly large amount of discussion in the interwar period. Auxiliary cruisers were this idea that an ocean liner, specifically liners more than freighters, but ocean liners, they're big, they're fast. So if you put guns on them, you could use them as commerce raiders in theory. Now, in practice, they really didn't work out that well, but you ended up having situations where, like, I believe the Brits, maybe the Germans, paid cruise ship lines to design their ships in such a way that they could mount a deck gun. That there was a place where you could put a deck gun and it would be adequately mounted and adequate framing and stuff, so that every time it fired, it didn't break the ship. And the idea being that you'd use these things. Now, in practice, like, nobody really ever did that. There was a little bit of that, I think, in World War I, virtually none in World War II, because it just turns out that just doesn't work very well. But those are a different thing. Those had their weapons displayed pretty obviously when they were put on. Q ships had lots of false things that, the wall would drop down and they'd have a broadside, and they just fire a broadside real quick. And so they were used both as commerce raiders and as hunter killers on submarines. And there's at least one. There was an Australian light cruiser that was sunk by a German Q ship.
Wow.
That was functioning as a commerce raider a long ways away from home. But it was specifically a German Q ship. It wasn't a Japanese Q ship. And it just, they got in such a good shot early on that they never got a radio report off. It was only later, I want to say they caught the Q ship later on, and when they were interrogating the crew, they said, yeah, we sunk one of your cruisers. So, while you're going on, I'm going to try to find that story real quick.
Okay. So the reason I brought up Q ships is because one of the things they do in the episode is they decide to go down to the colony or bring up one of the planetary disruptors from the colony that had been killed. And then they're going to put it in their cargo bay. The idea being that if they can get close enough to that Klingon bird of prey, and they're clearly cocky and aren't that worried about it, then they could hit the bird of prey with this giant planetary disruptor, and that should crack a hole in the bird of prey, and then from there it'd be a fight. So that's what happened. So the idea is that they allow so they go searching for the Klingon, and basically they're just trying to be. They try to estimate where it's going to go, and then be in a location that thing is probably, that bird of prey is going to show up. And if they can encounter it again, then maybe they can make, be all helpless and all that kind of stuff, lure the ship in close, and then take out the bird of prey. So in this case, like Chris said, being chivalrous and honorable can get you killed. So
there's a little bit of a discussion taking place about it. It was I think the Cormoran and the HMAS Sydney. So,
okay. And then, I found a paper all about Q ships and stuff. And one of the quotes in there was their instructions to the Q ship was, strictly observe the role of the decoy. If an enemy submarine is sighted, every effort is to be made to escape. And if the submarine opens fire, engines are to be stopped, and the ship's company, except the necessary engine room staff and the gun crews, who must be carefully out of sight, commence to abandon ship. The submarine should be allowed to come as close as possible to decoy, and then open fire by order of the whistle or steam siren, with the white ensign being hoisted at the same time. Do not fire unless you are pretty sure of making a hit. So let's see here. All right. So then once they wounded and damaged the Klingon bird of prey, it came by, as we can see here, got them in a tractor beam, and then they basically opened up their cargo bay, shot the Klingon in the soft underbelly once again, and did a bunch of damage to it. And this leads to the transporter tactics. Now, why didn't Dukat just beam the Klingon crew out into space? Well, let me back up. First, Kira and Dukat beam over to the Klingon ship in probably somewhere in engineering or someplace away from the bridge, kill a couple Klingons, and then they take the transporter room. And Kira knows Klingon transporter codes. So that's the only reason this appears to have worked, is she knows the Klingon transporter codes. So she's not only able to operate it, she's able to use the codes to also operate it. And what they do is they use the Klingon's transporter, and they beam the 36 Klingons, minus the 2 they just killed, over to the freighter. So you might wonder, why not just beam them out into space? Well, it appears that was Kira's plan. Like, later when Dukat destroys the freighter, she says, you shouldn't have done that. You didn't need to kill them. So she would not have probably agreed to a plan in which they beamed them and murdered them and beamed them out into space. So I don't think Dukat clearly had no problem with that. Now, the other explanation, I think Chris and I talked about this a little bit, was that there could be a safety mechanism in which, just because you have the transporter codes doesn't mean you can start beaming people into space, because, all it would take is one crazed or drunk or angry Klingon to start beaming people into space at some random point. So it could very well be that even Klingons have safety protocols that prevent someone from doing that. Did you have any thoughts on that one, Chris?
Or at the very least, Kira didn't know how to override it.
Right. And I would assume it would be only the captain that could override something like that, because other people are out for his job as as the captain of the ship. Yeah. So once on board, and they were in control of the Klingon ship, Dukat basically he altered the bargain and fired and destroyed his own freighter, killing the Klingons. But I believe this episode I like to infer that there are enough safeguards and restrictions in the use of transporters that they probably have a very narrow operating window that prevents people from let's say, using transporters to the full extent, to the full military extent that you could imagine. All of the dirty tricks you could use with the transporter, they're probably just not feasible, or there are enough defenses in place to prevent that sort of thing. And I think that's why we don't see transporters being egregiously abused like you'd think they would. They don't really address it. They don't talk about it that much. In Star Trek 2, when Kirk goes to yellow alert, Saavik says energize defense fields. I kind of see that as a transport inhibitor type thing. Doesn't mean those things are perfect either, but generally you can't beam through shields, but every now and then we see them come up with a trick that allows them to do it in this one instance. Let's see here. In one of the episodes, Nor the Battle to the Strong, where we see ground combat again between the Federation and the Klingons, transporters just didn't work because they had so much jamming in the area to prevent it. So I would imagine a lot of that same jamming is present in a space battle. And while you might have some windows that might allow for safe transport, you probably can't always do it. And transporters, despite what we saw in, the second J.J. Abrams movie, you can't just transport across the universe. Transporters have limited range, and it appears that you can't necessarily, transporting moving targets can be kind of difficult too.
So I
Anyways,
remember
go ahead.
that scene in First Contact, I think.
Mm-hmm.
That's one where they fight the Borg, right?
Yeah.
Okay. As a matter of fact, I'm wearing my Star Trek First Contact T-shirt because I worked at a company at the time that when a new Star Trek movie came out, it was company policy when a new Star Trek movie came out to close the company for the afternoon and take all the employees to see the new Star Trek movie and print T-shirts for it. So I have 2 Star Trek T-shirts from this company. In any event, what was I going to say? Oh, I recall that at one point, you may remember in that movie that at one point they said, Captain, our shields were down for like 10 seconds, at which point they immediately went into, oh shit, we should assume that they boarded us and we need to go look for them.
Yep.
So they weren't worried at all about it until they found out their shields were down. And then it's like, oh yeah, that's a big deal.
That's bad.
Yeah.
Yep. And, the Borg are more technologically advanced, so they might have some dirty tricks up their sleeves. Every now and then we see, in a limited way, the Dominion beaming through shields and that sort of thing. But their weapons also fired through Federation shields early on. And the other way to remember this is that this is a technological competition. So in sometimes maybe some transporter defense or, something that prevents the use of transporter might have the upper hand, and then somewhere transporter technology might have the upper hand. And then it's just kind of a back and forth. So at different times, we probably see different capabilities. At one point we see Janeway, she beams a photon torpedo over to a Borg ship. I think she gets away with it because the general mindset of a Starfleet officer is that such a tactic probably wouldn't work. She was probably desperate. I'd have to go back and rewatch that episode. But I suspect even the Borg adapt, so that tactic might not work a second time. And when the Next Generation crew beamed over, they were trying to save, Picard, so they didn't necessarily want to destroy that cube. Let's see here. So yeah, and then part of the other thing is like the game Starfleet Battles. They clearly spent some time thinking about, okay, if we have transporters and we have shuttles, what kind of ways, imaginative ways, would we come up with to utilize some of these things? So they came up with transporter bombs. You could never beam a transporter bomb onto a ship, but you could beam it out into space like a mine. And so it could be beamed out into empty space. Disadvantage of that, of course, is you had to lower your own shields to beam out one of these bombs. So you didn't want to do it if someone had their weapons pointing at you, and you could drop a little little mine out in front of them, but they're going to hit you through your down shield with all their weapons. So, it was a tactic that was of limited use. So that is.
Hey, Pat.
Yeah.
Somebody asked the question: do we ever see the Borg beam through shields?
We see them beam aboard the Enterprise, and yeah, I think they did beam through shields. I think there was, what was it, when they captured Picard? I think their shields were up, and the Borgs just beamed on over, grabbed Picard, and left. So
I have a dim recollection of Riker saying something later about how they'd fixed that.
Okay.
Was that there? But I'm the last person in the world to ask about the details of that episode.
Yeah. But at the same time, the Borg didn't really have shields per se. Of course they had the massive ability to repair themselves.
So I did a little research. I put it in the chat. By the way, I've been keeping up on chat, so I'm probably not going to do a separate chat perusal like I normally do, like I do when I'm not able to keep up on chat. So the Cormoran versus HMAS Sydney, it actually lists the Cormoran as being an auxiliary cruiser, But I would argue that it would be better described as being a Q ship. And the reason why I would say that is because its armament was camouflage.
Okay.
So auxiliary cruisers basically put it right out there, right? They were commissioned by whatever power built them, and they would go out and do stuff as a general rule. But the Germans were being sneakier about that, and so I think if you're sneaky, you're a Q ship. So, but Q ships are one of those things that there's a lot of things that fit in the category of, boy, this sounds like a good idea, but in reality, it turns out they're not nearly as effective as you might think. The effectiveness of Q ships in dealing with submarines, for instance, was really quite low in World War I. And then by the time World War II rolled around, when they just said, you know what, I think we're just going to torpedo shit. Once they started just immediately going to torpedoing stuff, Q ships really didn't do any good against submarines. But they might be they were useful in the way that the Germans used them potentially as commerce raiders, just disguised commerce raiders, so they could get closer to something before they threatened it. Right. So from that standpoint. But it's, like I said, it's really funny how much of the various treaties and just brain power in the 1920s and 30s was spent worrying about this thing that turned out to not be an issue at all, really, once the war happened. So, but that doesn't mean that it couldn't be that way in science fiction. Way back when I did that modular starship idea, that thing that we put together at the one Bu9 annual meeting, and then decided that it wasn't going to be an Honorverse thing after all. I mean, that thing is basically just a container ship that could spit out containers into open space. If you made all those, you could easily end up with a situation, I would argue, where you load it up with freight and it's a freighter, you load it up with weapons and it's something else entirely. Whether you could put that many weapons on, I don't know, but I mean, there's more to being auxiliary cruisers show that there's more to being a warship than just the ability to tack a weapon on it.
Right. There's targeting. There's the whole targeting. Can you hit something?
There's training. There's
you're also then
ship, etc.
You're also then allocating manpower towards this minimally effective ship, where maybe that manpower would be better allocated someplace else, right? Even if it's a good idea, you've got to determine whether the money and resources spent on it could have been better spent someplace else.
Now, have you ever played the game Full Thrust?
Sure.
So if you remember correctly from the ship construction rules in Full Thrust, which I think were in More Thrust, well, maybe they were in the base game. The ship construction rules give you two different options for how you construct a warship. You can either construct it using commercial standards, or you can construct it using warship standards. And if you construct it using commercial standards, it's a lot less durable, but it's also a lot cheaper. Now, here in the real world, turns out you can do the same thing. In the U.S. Navy standards are way different than commercial standards. You can see it in just easy stuff, like, for instance, on a warship, there's a certain deck that's called the damage control deck, and if you go below that deck, there are no interpenetrations between compartments. So below, like, the second deck on an aircraft carrier, if you want to go from one part of the third deck to another part of the third deck, you have to go up to the second deck and up and over. I think it's the second deck on an aircraft carrier. So once you get to a certain part, you can go up and down, but you can't go side to side. If you want to go side to side, you have to go up and over and down again. Get to that. Whereas, on a freighter, on a commercial ship, you may have watertight doors in between those spaces, but you're allowed to have penetrations. And, you'd think, I've got a watertight door. What's the big deal? Well, you take damage, doors can be sprung, right?
Water comes through with a phenomenal amount of force.
Yeah. And so even if you got a watertight door there, If you bang it up enough and get it out of true, that door will just pop right open.
Mm-hmm.
So as it turns out, the rest of the world doesn't necessarily follow something that we would call warship standards. Like, for instance, I believe it is the case, if I remember correctly, that the Japanese ships, kind of looks like an Arleigh Burke from the outside. It's described as being their equivalent of an Arleigh Burke, and that it's got a spy radar and it's got an Aegis combat system, et cetera, et cetera. But the construction standards are a lot closer to being commercial standards than they are to our standards. And I knew somebody who had spent some time on one of those ships, on the Kirishima, named after the World War II battleship. And he said they had really wide passageways. I think they had false drop ceilings, which is just like a no-no. We don't have any of that stuff on our ships anymore. There's only a few spaces that'll have drop ceilings anymore, and that's because you got to be able to get the stuff to repair it in damage. You don't want to have to be pulling down the drop ceiling to try to figure out where the thing that's leaking is or where the short is. Mm-hmm. So we got rid of all that stuff when we just hang. That's the other thing that you don't see in Star Trek, right? They've got these nice pristine passageways, these nice pristine hallways, whereas you walk down a U.S. Navy ship and here's a fire axe, and here's a litter for with a backboard to carry somebody away if they've been hurt, and over here there's some just random timbers to shore up spaces, and here's a jack, and here's a fire hose, and just all over the place. Mm-hmm. It's just connected to the walls. And I think in theory all that stuff is behind panels, but anybody who's ever tried to find something in their kitchen that they don't use all the time knows the folly of that. Right. One of these panels has to have a fire extinguisher behind it.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, looks like we've hit our time today. So anyhow, everybody, thank you once again for joining us. It's always been a pleasure. Always a pleasure to do these. And please hit the like and subscribe buttons. Go ahead, Chris.
One last thought. I'm going to respond to something Rob Davidoff said. World War II light fleet carriers, the Royal Navy had merchant standards, right? Or were they merchant yards, but Navy standards? Those were... I'm not sure. I know that they were intended to be temporary ships, right? And it's really funny because they built 3 of the, I want to say, the Courageous class, and they all lasted for like 40 years, right? Despite the Royal Navy in World War II literally built a class of aircraft carriers that their plan was, we'll fight the war with these things and then we'll just throw them away afterwards. Mm-hmm. And they ended up selling them off, and they were in service forever and ever and ever. Like, one of them ended up in Australian service and was the last Australian aircraft carrier.
Oh, wow.
And to take another little science fiction spin on it, the last captain of that ship, or at least the last master of that ship, was A. Bertram Chandler, who was a relatively well-known science fiction writer of the 1970s. I'm trying to remember the name of his main character, who was in almost all of his books. But the maritime law said that the ship had to have a master on board. Mm-hmm. And even though it was in the ship, it was like pierside. They were waiting to scrap it. And so he had a job at one point where he just basically lived pretty much by himself on this aircraft carrier for like 9 months. I could do that.
Really? Well, you're kind of doing that. You've kind of been doing that this last year.
It would be cool to just go explore an aircraft carrier, to have a job that just said, yeah, you have to go to all the different spaces and make sure they're not flooding.
Yeah.
But I think he spent the rest of the time just writing novels. So.
Okay. Yeah, I suspect that would get old after about a week.
So, yep, probably.
All right.
So I think we're done.
All right. Sounds good. Have a good night, everybody. Have a great week. We'll see you next week. All right.
All right. See you later.